My first full year living in Spain, I wrote a novel. It was a coming-of-age type novel about growing up in the desert surrounded by addiction, abuse, and mental illness. In other words, autobiographical. I'd write on sheets of printer paper between my classes at the language school, with a pen. I couldn't afford a laptop. Almost nobody could in those days. After I'd filled a number of sheets with scribbling, and it started to look like I had an actual novel on my hands, I bought some 4x6 index cards, or more likely, their metric system equivalent, so I could map out a plot. Spending €3 on index cards was quite an investment in those days. I couldn't eat them, they weren't keeping me warm during the harsh European winters, and they weren't directly leading to me getting laid. But I saw those €3 as an investment in my future. Don't get me wrong, I had no illusions about publishing a successful coming-of-age novel. This was all about the inner journey. I would write the novel and, in the process, become the kind of person who was capable of achieving goals. I still remember laying out the index cards on the floor of my friend's messy flat and contemplating all the work I would have to do if I wanted to finish writing my first book. It was intimidating, doing all that for no tangible payoff. But in the winter of 2006, I sat down and did it. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 90, about 20 years in Spain. Here in Spain, the expat crowd has a word that we call our Spainiversary. Your Spainiversary, obviously, is the anniversary of your moving to Spain. Mine is in late October of every year, so I am currently celebrating 20 years. That is a big number, and it's a cause for celebration. My way of celebrating these days is podcasting about it. I'm also going to take a hike somewhere and eat some steak. I would probably do that anyway, though. Shout out this time to Jan Mark. Jan Mark has joined the elite club of donors to the podcast here, supporters of the podcast here. With the financial support of people like Jan Mark, I can continue doing great things. Thank you very much, Jan Mark. Jan Mark is up in the Netherlands, and he says that he travels to Barcelona for business pretty regularly. He has a business in Spain, actually, and that my podcast is helping him to understand Barcelona and her people better. That's awesome. I'm happy that my research and the effort that I spend writing about Barcelona is also helpful to others. If you would like to join the elite group of supporters of this podcast, financial supporters of this podcast, you can go to expatmadrid.com/donate and enter the quantity of your choosing. expatmadrid.com/donate. I appreciate it. Thank you very much to everyone for listening, and thank you to the elite club of supporters for supporting. Anyway, back to that cold January many years ago when I was writing my novel. Because back in Madrid, I was able to convince my boss at the language school to write a letter about some research I needed to do, which I took to the National Library. They made me a reader card, and I wrote a good number of pages there while looking through books about psychology and philosophy. The National Library was a less cold option than hanging out on some park bench between classes, and they also had a cafe that had coffee for around 90 cents, if I recall correctly. Staying warm and not spending a lot of money were two of my big passions in those days. So I spent a lot of time at the National Library. After a few months, I had a first draft. I had also moved into a flat with someone who owned a computer. I spent the summer typing the draft into the word processor, editing as I went along. It ended up being around 100,000 words, respectable novel length, and I didn't think it was terrible. Of course, it might have been terrible in ways I was unaware of. Actually, it probably was. In hindsight, I can almost guarantee it was terrible. But I finished it, printed a copy out at a print shop, emailed myself the text file, and mostly forgot about it. Like I said, this wasn't about becoming a novelist. It was about becoming a person who achieves his goals. I still had no long-term vision, but I figured the ability to set goals and achieve them would bend the arc of my life towards something more positive, eventually. After that summer of frantic typing, I struggled to write anything else. I was pretty burnt out on writing. So I spent a lot of time cooking. I realized later that I was just expressing my creativity through making lasagna. Apparently, I had to create something, and it didn't really matter what. Eventually, I wrote a few articles for online magazines that no longer exist. I tried my hand at short stories in Spanish. I composed wordy emails to friends back home. In the meantime, I had other goals. I'd just overstayed my Spanish tourist visa, so getting legal was one of them. But that was large, ambiguous, and didn't depend on me. So I was also just trying to apply the Kaizen method to my life. Small improvements, 1% at a time, which might add up to something else. James Clear of Atomic Habits fame was still in college at that point, so the 1% thing wasn't yet popular. I actually got the idea of constant, never-ending improvement from some pirated Tony Robbins audios that I'd got online. Sorry, Tony. Later, I pirated a PDF of The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss and thought old Timmy was pretty enthusiastic in a Silicon Valley type way that had nothing to do with my life. My life at the time as an illegal immigrant in the second worst neighborhood in Madrid. It's hard for me to remember exactly how I got through those days and years, but apparently I didn't have enough money to just buy a book and pay for shipping. Sorry, Tim. Something in the book must have inspired me, though, because soon after reading The 4-Hour Work Week, I started blogging. The first iteration of my expat blog was on Tumblr, and no one was writing anything lengthy over there. I spent the first year just sharing quotes and pictures. After a while, I started writing articles about life in Spain or life back in Arizona, which were several paragraphs long. Around the same time, with an eye towards actually making some money, I started a second blog in Spanish, where I was explaining English grammar and vocabulary to people who wanted to learn the language. By this time, we were deep in the Great Recession, and writing was good for a couple of reasons. One, it was a way to spend time that didn't cost any money. And two, I was probably going to be deported and wanted to have a backup plan for when it happened. I figured if I could get enough traffic on my educational blog, I'd be able to make ad money until I got back on my feet in Costa Rica or something. This is what the kids today are calling a strong extrinsic motivation. The new goal, then, was become a successful blogger or die trying. I worked my ass off on the blog. At the same time, I was going all over Madrid giving English classes for my day job. The recession hit Spain hard, but at least I was employed. My teacher's salary wasn't great, but I could work all day and half the night if I wanted, even Saturdays and Sundays. The demand was intense. At the end of the month, I'd have a stack of 20s and 50s, which I'd take to the bank for my rent payment. The rest was for protein and cheap wine. Somehow I was getting by, albeit illegally. In the end, the Spanish government sent me a letter telling me to leave, but they didn't actually deport me. I stayed, eventually got my visa situation worked out, and became a legitimate tax-paying resident. But I also kept writing. You may already know that novelists are not well paid. It's the kind of thing that writers love to write about, the struggle of getting an agent, getting published, and trying to make a living. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that unless you happen to sell millions of copies, being an author isn't so much a career as it is a really shitty lifestyle choice. And most books sell hundreds, not millions, of copies. I didn't want to play the find an agent and a publisher game at all. Going through all that rejection for a few royalty checks or maybe a small advance didn't seem worth it. But when I saw that someone from an online forum, apparently just some guy like me, had published a book on Amazon, I looked into it. Turns out anyone could self-publish on Kindle, and rumor had it that Amazon would soon be opening in Spain. Well, that was interesting. What could I do? I picked a boring topic and sat at my kitchen table all summer while my roommates were back in the Pueblo, writing an ebook to sell on Amazon. I couldn't afford to put on the air conditioner or go on vacation, so eating fried eggs and writing about phrasal verbs was most of my summer plan. I published on Kindle Direct Publishing and then kept on writing articles. Writing an educational ebook was boring and repetitive, but it wasn't nearly as hard as writing a novel. By that winter, I'd sold several dozen copies and made an income literally in the low three figures as an author. As far as I could tell, that put me close to the top of the writing game. Making a career out of writing is a bit like becoming a professional athlete. It's bound to happen to someone, but that someone is probably not you. Getting paid three figures for something you've written is already an accomplishment. I figured if I did more of what I was doing, I could make it to four figures. And four figures was halfway to 8, right? A new goal started forming in my brain. Maybe I could become a writer full-time. Over the next few years, I wrote a lot more grammar books and made some online courses. I created paperback versions of any book that sold more than a few copies. Some books did much better than others, but it was always a bit hit or miss. Eventually, though, I was making enough from my side hustle as an author that I could afford to quit my day job. You know the scene in movies where someone's alarm goes off and they slap at the snooze button, but eventually they have to get up anyway because they've got some stupid job to go to? Well, I still haven't made it to 8 figures, but I also have no idea what that's like. It's been years since I got out of bed because of financial necessity. Even my last few years as a teacher, I jumped up in the mornings ready to attack the rat race with all I had. My financial independence plan was working, and victory was inevitable. I just wasn't quite there yet. On June 30th, 2015, I cashed my last paycheck and walked away from the Spanish labor market, hopefully forever. The first articles of any substance I wrote on the Expat blog were called things like Memories of a Redneck and Teaching for Dropouts. The first was about happy childhood memories of shooting rats in the junkyard owned by my best friend's grandparents. The second was about the irony of having failed to get a formal education myself, and now finding myself in the position of educating others. I think I was discovering that my background was a bit unusual for the type of situations I was finding myself in here in Europe. Maybe that's a normal part of becoming an adult, but I didn't realize that at the time. When I was a kid back in the Arizona desert, almost everybody else had also grown up in the Arizona desert, just like me. In theory, the adults also had backstories of some kind, but I wasn't interested in them. Eventually, at my school, we got some kids who, in a shocking twist, had grown up in the suburbs of New York or Chicago before their dads had been sent to Phoenix for work. Those kids had actually tried drugs and generally led much more interesting lives than I had. By the time I had dropped out of university, moved to Spain, and written a novel, I was feeling like I was on quite a unique life path and making up everything about adult life as I went along. Surely nobody else from the Arizona desert was living a life like mine. As I got older, my story continued getting weirder, but now I realize that's probably normal. We're all on a journey of some kind, and life has its bumps, obstacles, and plot holes. Through it all, I've been writing. We got through the economic crisis, the pandemic, and several changes in government, both here in Spain and back in the US. And the excitement shows no signs of stopping, or even slowing down. Life, as they say, is just one damn thing after another. This week, as I mentioned, I'm celebrating 20 years of life in Spain. 20 years! That is, by most standards, a long time. One of the other reasons I wrote my novel back in the early part of the century was to make sense of some of the things that happened to me growing up. Articles like this one do the same thing. If you have some sort of brilliant life plan that you're following year after year, good for you. Because I'm doing no such thing. I have short and midterm goals and a vision of a better long-term future. But that vision is pretty vague and could take a number of forms. Life is largely plotless. But by writing about your experience, you can turn a series of loosely interconnected events into a plausible narrative with a why, and hopefully learn something in hindsight. From the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, I learned, back in my National Library days, that there are fundamentally two types of people. Those who make great demands upon themselves and live an effortful life, and those who are content to be just as they are, mere buoys that float on the waves. I was, pretty clearly, the first type. The fact that I was at the National Library reading a philosophy book at all should have tipped me off. A philosophy book written in a foreign language I'd learned largely on my own, incidentally. Looking back, I'm not sure that any of this sounds like normal behavior for a guy in his early 20s, but being normal is overrated. I just wanted to develop my potential in some way, and in the process avoid working a 9-to-5 job. And I did. Of course, a lot else has happened in 20 years. I've got articles and podcasts about some of the key points. I spent my share of time indulging in youthful stupidity. I dated plenty of Spanish girls. I almost destroyed my liver. I turned 40. I got married. I bought a house. I even tried to integrate into Spanish culture, and mostly failed. As usual, I was tempted to write some sort of inane list post to celebrate this occasion. 20 things I've learned in 20 years of life abroad, for example. But then I remembered that I've been doing this whole living abroad and writing about it thing since long before Airbnb, before Instagram, and before digital nomads. If you wanted to make travel your whole personality 20 years ago, you could. But there was no way to broadcast it to everyone you had ever met and many people you hadn't. So you'd go somewhere and end up sleeping in some dingy hostel you'd seen in a Lonely Planet guide. And if you wanted to tell someone about it, you'd write them a postcard. I remember those days. In other words, I'm old school, and I might as well embrace it. The other day, someone actually asked me where I'd started my rather strange journey from college dropout to freelance writer, etc. And I told the truth. It was in the library. The public library back in Phoenix, with books. I sometimes wish teenage Daniel had had a better idea about what he wanted to do with his life, but he was just really into books. And that explains a lot of what came after. Writing that awful novel, my career as a grammar guy, this blog and podcast, and I'm just getting started here. That's why this little bit of middle-aged introspection is about, of all things, my life as a writer, more than my life as an American abroad. Reading taught me pretty early on that I didn't have to limit myself to what was visible within my own horizons, or the horizons of those around me, because luckily a lot of smarter people than myself have taken the time to write down their thoughts and visions and share them with the world. I'm grateful for all of them. From Marcus Aurelius to Bill Bryson, about 2,000 years of authors have sat down to share their worldview, and I've got nothing but gratitude, and several shelves full of their collected wisdom. Thank you for listening. That's about all I've got for today. I just wanted to end on the note of gratitude. things could have gone much differently for me, and I spend a lot of time wondering why. I honestly could have ended up cooking meth in some trailer like one of these characters in Breaking Bad. I haven't watched Breaking Bad, but you know, the basic idea of people in the desert cooking meth, I am very familiar with because that's where I grew up. Through some combination of luck and occasional good decisions on my part, I ended up not in that situation, and I am very grateful for all the help I've received along the way. The opportunities that I've had being here in Spain have been great. People do not usually think of Spain as the land of opportunity, like they might think of, I don't know, the US, but for me, it's worked out very well, and I'm grateful for that. And of course, I'm also grateful to you for listening. So, thank you very much. Remember, you can like and follow this podcast wherever you're listening. You can leave me a review. You can go to expatmadrid.com/donate and join the elite club of financial supporters of this project. You can go over to YouTube and write Learn Spanish with Daniel in the little search bar. You will find my videos where I'm teaching Spanish. This bit didn't make it into the article about 20 years in Spain, but when I was back in the desert, I ended up working in a cafe that had a kitchen with some guys from Mexico. I learned a ton of Spanish just working in a kitchen with some random immigrant guys. And once I moved to Spain and started living my own immigrant life, the Spanish that I had learned came in very handy at making my life better. So I'm grateful for those guys. No contact with any of them, but I hope they're doing well, whatever they're up to these days. Anyway, that's Learn Spanish with Daniel over on YouTube. You could also follow me on Instagram. Just look for Daniel Welsh, Welsch on Instagram. I'm not super active on there, but I'm around. You can send me a message on there if you'd like. You can send me a message through a lot of different platforms. Leave a comment on one of my YouTube videos. I don't know. Whatever works for you. That is, as the saying goes, all I've got for today. Thank you very much for listening, and hasta la próxima. Bye.